History doesn't reward the bold or the brave. It rewards whoever made the fewest catastrophic decisions. These 42 people did not get that memo. 1. The popular defense of Caligula is that ancient sources were biased, that he was a misunderstood ruler unfairly maligned by political enemies, writing decades after his death. Here's the problem with that defense. The sources disagree on almost everything except the parts that make him look completely unhinged, which suggests the unhinged parts are probably the accurate ones. Caligula declared war on Neptune, the god of the ocean, marched his entire army to the coastline, and ordered soldiers to stab the water with their spears and collect seashells as official military trophies, which he then sent back to Rome as proof of victory over the sea. He appointed his horse Incitatus to the Roman Senate, furnished the animal with a marble stable, an ivory feeding trough, and a dedicated household staff, presumably because the horse's judgment was comparable to the senators already seated there. He burned grain stockpiles during an active famine to punish citizens he considered insufficiently enthusiastic about him, which is a governing philosophy so targeted in its cruelty it almost requires admiration. He ruled for 4 years before his own Praetorian Guard, the men whose entire job description was absorbing attacks on his behalf, decided that stabbing him personally was the more attractive career option. When the people hired specifically to die for you conclude that killing you is the better shift, you are not misunderstood. You were understood completely, assessed accurately, and voted off the premises with a blade. 2. The myth insists Napoleon was an undefeated tactical deity whose failures were products of betrayal, weather, and enemies who simply refused to fight fairly. This version of history is extremely popular and almost entirely wrong. Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812 with roughly 685,000 soldiers and retreated with approximately 100,000, the remainder having been consumed by cold, starvation, disease, and the consequences of marching an enormous army into a winter he apparently did not expect to be cold. His final defeat at Waterloo was partly his own editorial decision. He delayed the battle's opening by several hours, waiting for the ground to dry, which gave his enemies time to regroup and receive the reinforcements that ended his career permanently. He was exiled twice, the second time specifically because European powers collectively decided that the first exile had been overly optimistic about his retirement intentions. He died on a remote island of either stomach cancer or arsenic poisoning from damp wallpaper, and historians cannot reach consensus on which. Which means even his exit managed to be undignified in ways that remain unresolved. Invading Russia without accounting for the existence of winter is not a strategic miscalculation. It is the equivalent of scheduling an outdoor event, watching it rain, and describing yourself as the victim of unexpected meteorological aggression. 3. The story says, Nero played the fiddle while Rome burned in 64 AD, laughing at the spectacle of a city he may have personally ignited. An image so perfectly villainous that essentially everyone repeats it without pausing to ask a single logistical question. Here's the first question worth asking. The fiddle did not exist for another 1,000 years. The instrument was developed in medieval Europe, placing Nero's alleged performance in the category of things that are physically impossible, rather than merely unlikely. Historical accounts suggest Nero was 35 miles away in Antium when the fire started and returned to Rome to organize emergency relief, opened his palace gardens to displaced residents, and subsidized emergency grain supplies at below-market prices in the aftermath. The rumor was circulated by political enemies who had ample legitimate reasons to despise him, because Nero also murdered his own mother, which provides more than sufficient material for a negative historical reputation without fabricating musical performances during urban disasters. The fire destroyed significant portions of Rome, and Nero used the cleared land to build an enormous personal palace complex, which is genuinely suspicious, but that is a different accusation than the fiddle story, and it has the advantage of being supported by evidence. Nero was terrible. This specific crime was invented. Blaming someone for a sandwich they didn't steal when they robbed the entire bank is not moral clarity. It is just poor record keeping. 4. The conventional framing presents Idi Amin as a ruthless but strategically coherent strongman who understood power and used it with calculated brutality. This assessment credits him with a consistency his actual decisions do not support. Amin awarded himself a Victoria Cross, a Congressional Medal of Honor, and the title Conqueror of the British Empire, none of which any issuing authority had offered him and none of which any international body recognized, because he had simply decided he deserved them and acquired the medals accordingly. In 1972, he expelled all 60,000 Ugandan Asians in 90 days, immediately collapsing the commercial infrastructure they operated, triggering an economic collapse he then blamed on foreign interference, having just expelled the foreign nationals who were running the functional parts of the economy. He wrote personal letters to Queen Elizabeth offering to marry her and sent unsolicited strategic advice to Richard Nixon, apparently operating under the impression that both parties were awaiting his guidance. He declared himself King of Scotland despite never visiting Scotland, and Scotland having no mechanism through which this title could be granted, because he wanted the title and considered wanting it sufficient authorization. This is not strategic brutality operating behind a theatrical facade. This is a man walking into a trophy shop he has broken into, handing himself every award on the shelves, and then expressing genuine confusion when the sporting leagues decline to update their records. 5. Gaddafi's 42-year rule is frequently cited as evidence of political genius, a masterful reading of power that sustained a regime through decades of international pressure, internal dissent, and shifting alliances. The accounting becomes more complicated when you examine the decisions. He developed his own political philosophy called the Third Universal Theory, published it in a document known as the Green Book, which proposed the simultaneous elimination of all governments and all companies globally, and then apparently expected nations to voluntarily adopt this framework, which none did. He traveled internationally with a tent he pitched on the actual lawns of foreign heads of state and brought a camel as a component of his official diplomatic entourage on visits to Europe, which is a hospitality approach that prioritizes personal comfort over the feelings of the host nation. In 2011, during a popular uprising against his government, he gave a televised address attributing the entire rebellion to young citizens who had been drugged by Osama bin Laden, who had been dead for weeks at the time of the broadcast. His final days were spent concealed in a drainage pipe, which is where 42 years of political survival concluded, in a concrete culvert beneath a road. Surviving 4 decades in power and ending in a drainage ditch is not a masterclass in political endurance. It is the longest possible route to the least dignified available destination, and the route itself was mostly self-directed. 6. The narrative offers Robert Mugabe as a cautionary tale of gradual corruption, a genuine liberation hero who started with legitimate intentions and slowly lost his way under the accumulated pressures of power and age. The warning signs were present considerably earlier than this framing suggests, and the economic destruction was not accidental drift. It was deliberate policy, consistently implemented. Zimbabwe's land reform program beginning in 2000 seized productive agricultural operations and redistributed them without transition infrastructure or technical support, collapsing food production and triggering an inflationary spiral that reached 89.7 sextillion% annually by 2008, a number so large that standard calculators cannot display it and most people cannot meaningfully conceptualize it. The government printed a $100 trillion note that could not purchase a bus ticket, which is a denomination that represents either a complete collapse of the relationship between numbers and value, or performance art, and the people waiting for that bus were not amused either way. Mugabe blamed Western sanctions for the economic conditions, while spending state funds on international luxury travel, 21 elaborate cakes for his annual birthday celebration, and overseas shopping expeditions. He was removed in 2017 by his own military in a coup and appeared on television afterward, seemingly uncertain about why this was occurring. Printing a $100 trillion note that cannot buy bread is not losing your way. It is arriving at the precise destination your decisions were always generating and then expressing surprise at the address. 7. The preferred framing for the Great Leap Forward describes it as a well-intentioned modernization effort that failed due to circumstances beyond any planner's control. Drought, internal resistance, and the inherent difficulty of rapid industrialization. The actual mechanism of the failure was policy overriding evidence at every available opportunity, and the people warning that it would not work were the ones who understood agriculture. The campaign to eliminate sparrows, officially called the Great Sparrow Campaign, directed citizens to bang pots and drums until birds died of exhaustion mid-flight, ultimately killing hundreds of millions of sparrows that had been controlling insect populations. The locust swarms that followed devastated the crops the sparrow elimination was meant to protect, producing a self-generated ecological disaster that required no external assistance. Steel production targets were met by melting farming tools and household cookware, leaving the agricultural population simultaneously without equipment and without containers, which addressed neither food production nor food storage. Local officials falsified harvest reports upward to avoid punishment for shortfalls, meaning the central government exported grain abroad while the population starved, because on paper the harvest was abundant. Estimated deaths range between 15 and 55 million in 4 years, a range so wide that the uncertainty itself constitutes a data point about what happens when record-keeping collapses along with the food supply. Killing every sparrow to protect your harvest, and then watching locusts consume it, is not an unfortunate coincidence. It is a closed loop of predictable consequences that any farmer with basic ecological awareness could have sketched in advance. 8. Stalin's defenders offer a specific bargain. The methods were monstrous, but the industrial and military results were genuine, and without that brutal modernization, the Soviet Union would not have survived the Second World War. The bargain has a significant structural problem. Stalin actively gutted Soviet military capability immediately before the most consequential military threat in the country's history. The Great Purge, between 1936 and 1938, executed or imprisoned approximately 35,000 Red Army officers, including 3 of 5 marshals and 13 of 15 army commanders, eliminating the military's experienced leadership 2 years before Germany invaded. When the invasion came in June of 1941, Stalin reportedly entered a psychological shutdown lasting days, leaving the country without functioning command at the precise moment it needed leadership most urgently. Intelligence from multiple independent sources, including Soviet agents operating within German military planning, warned of the invasion date with remarkable specificity. Stalin dismissed every warning as Western disinformation and a pattern of selective skepticism that managed to disbelieve the accurate reports while the army he had just decimated absorbed the initial assault. The Soviet Union survived the war despite Stalin's decisions in 1941, not because of them, at a cost of approximately 27 million Soviet lives. Firing your entire experienced coaching staff before the championship, ignoring the scouting report from your own analysts, and then claiming credit when your deeply depleted team survives is a form of institutional courage that requires decades of uninterrupted self-confidence to develop. 9. The scholarly concession to the Khmer Rouge suggests that, however monstrous its methods, the regime operated according to a coherent ideological framework rooted in agrarian Marxist theory, a twisted vision that nonetheless contained internal logic. The policies do not support this reading. The logic consistently destroyed the agrarian foundations it claimed to be constructing. Year Zero evacuated cities entirely in a matter of days, including active hospitals, where patients were moved out of beds and into the streets regardless of their condition because urban existence had been reclassified as ideologically impure. Wearing glasses was treated as evidence of literacy and therefore bourgeois status, making corrective eyewear a capital offense in a policy that managed to be simultaneously lethal and optically surreal as a phrase. Rice production quotas were set at levels the agricultural workforce could not physically meet, and farmers who failed to meet them were executed, systematically removing the laborers needed to grow the rice required to fulfill the quotas that were getting the farmers killed. In 4 years, the regime killed between 1.5 and 2 million people, approximately 25% of Cambodia's entire population. Executing the farmers for insufficient harvests is not agricultural policy operating under distorted priorities. It is destroying the production mechanism you depend on while simultaneously escalating the production demands and then expressing frustration that output is declining. 10. The revised assessment of Francisco Franco concedes his political crimes while salvaging a reputation for economic management, pointing to Spain's growth in the 1960s as evidence that the regime could at least run a functional economy. The growth during that period was real. The connection to Franco's judgment is considerably more complicated. His foundational economic policy was autarky, complete national self-sufficiency, which produced rationing systems, expansive black markets, and poverty rates that kept Spain among Western Europe's most economically depressed countries for nearly 2 decades after the Civil War ended. The 1959 stabilization plan that reversed the decline was designed by economists known as the Opus Dei technocrats, who had to work systematically around Franco's ideological preferences in order to implement market-oriented reforms he personally opposed on principle. The economy improved. Franco took credit for the improvement while continuing to oppose the liberalization that generated it, which is a relationship between cause and effect that requires sustained curiosity to maintain. He ultimately selected as his successor a monarch, Juan Carlos, who immediately upon Franco's death began dismantling the Franco system and overseeing Spain's transition to democracy, suggesting that Franco's judgment about who shared his values was approximately as reliable as his economic instincts. Being the manager of a restaurant that succeeds specifically because the kitchen staff ignored your recipes is not a culinary achievement. It is proximity to competence while facing in the opposite direction, which is a different category entirely. 11. The one political myth so durable it has become a casual shorthand for basic administrative competence. Mussolini made the trains run on time. Whatever else you say about the fascists, they were efficient. The trains ran on time. Except they did not, and the claim was constructed almost entirely by journalists who visited showcase rail routes during carefully managed press tours and then reported their limited experience as a comprehensive system assessment. Italian train punctuality improvements were already underway before Mussolini's rise to power in 1922, meaning the momentum predated the regime that received credit for it. Italian citizens and internal government documents throughout the fascist period contain extensive complaints about continued delays and operational dysfunction across the actual national network, rather than the demonstration routes shown to foreign visitors. Mussolini's real administrative legacy included an economy that entered the Second World War so fundamentally unprepared that Italian military forces ran short of functional boots, adequate fuel, and mechanically reliable vehicles within months of initial mobilization. A government that successfully convinces foreign observers that it is running trains on time while the actual trains are running late has achieved exactly one thing: very effective public relations, which turns out to be insufficient when your armored divisions are running on fumes and improvised footwear. The myth survived because it was useful, not because anyone with access to the actual timetables bothered to check. 12. King Charles XXII of Spain is typically described as a sickly and unfortunate monarch, born into difficult circumstances, a sympathetic figure overwhelmed by the physical consequences of his inheritance. The circumstances were not accidental. They were the documented result of a dynasty that had spent generations optimizing for political alliances through cousin marriage until the biological consequences became impossible to ignore or govern around. His coefficient of inbreeding exceeded the mathematical equivalent of the offspring of two biological siblings, achieved through multiple generations of strategic Habsburg matrimonial policy that prioritized dynastic continuity over genetic diversity with an enthusiasm that history has since assessed as misguided. He could not chew solid food due to the Habsburg jaw, a protruding underbite so pronounced it became the dynasty's defining portrait feature across generations of royal painting, appearing in canvas after canvas like a recurring editorial comment on the family's decision-making. He reportedly could not walk reliably until age 8 and struggled with literacy throughout his life. He died without heirs in 1700, and the entire Spanish Habsburg line ended with him, the predictable biological conclusion of a genealogy that had been looping back on itself for over a century. When your family's portrait gallery functions as a sequential before and after advertisement for the importance of genetic diversity, the surprise is not that the line ended. The genuine surprise is that anyone in the family expressed any surprise at all when it did. 13. Warren Harding's defenders offer an explanation for the wholesale corruption of his administration. He was a decent and trusting man who happened to appoint corrupt officials without knowing they were corrupt. An innocent surrounded by operators who exploited his good nature. He personally appointed those officials. He was warned about several of them by advisors who were not subtle in their assessments. His administration became a near-comprehensive catalog of political fraud that historians still use as a baseline for executive branch dysfunction. His interior secretary secretly leased federal oil reserves to private companies in exchange for direct cash payments, becoming the first sitting cabinet member convicted of a felony committed while holding office, a distinction that required specific initiative to achieve. His attorney general operated what contemporaries called the Department of Easy Virtue, selling pardons, government appointments, and regulatory permits from a property near the White House that became known by a nickname reflecting its function rather than its address. Harding simultaneously maintained a decade-long affair with one woman whose husband he paid a monthly stipend to tolerate the arrangement, and conducted a separate relationship with another woman partly in a White House closet, suggesting his judgment in personnel selection extended consistently across both professional and personal contexts. He died in office in 1923 before the full scope of the corruption became publicly known, which spared him the experience of reading what historians were about to conclude. Hiring the entire cast of a corruption scandal and then dying before the reviews are published is not misfortune. It is aggressively convenient editorial timing. 14. King John of England exists in the cultural imagination primarily as the cartoon villain of Robin Hood stories, a simplification that manages to be less damning than the historical record he actually produced. The historical John achieved something genuinely difficult, being worse than his fictional depiction, which required sustained commitment across a reign of remarkable operational failure. He lost virtually every major English territory in France through a combination of military incompetence and his remarkable ability to alienate every potential ally before they could be useful, earning the contemporary nickname Soft Sword from people who were nominally on his side. His tax collection methods were so arbitrary, aggressive, and personally targeted that his own barons organized an armed revolt and forced him to sign Magna Carta in 1215, a document that exists specifically and entirely because John could not be trusted to behave within any boundaries that were not legally formalized and physically enforced by armed noblemen. He lost the crown jewels in a tidal estuary crossing due to poor route planning, misplacing the physical symbols of monarchy through a logistical failure that required a specific combination of overconfidence and inadequate preparation to generate. He died of dysentery in 1216 while actively losing a civil war he had personally provoked in the same year foreign troops were occupying London. When your reign's most enduring contribution to civilization is a legal document written specifically to constrain your behavior, the folktales have not exaggerated your character. They have merely translated it into a format accessible to children. 15. The sympathetic account of Nicholas II frames him as a gentle and well-meaning man overwhelmed by revolutionary forces operating at a scale no individual leader could have redirected, a tragic figure destroyed by circumstances beyond his influence. Nicholas made active decisions at nearly every available turning point, and those decisions consistently pointed toward the outcome he received. He dismissed repeated opportunities for constitutional reform that might have preserved the monarchy in some functional form, refusing proposals urged by his own advisors, by foreign ambassadors, and by family members who watched the political situation deteriorating with increasing alarm over multiple years. He allowed Grigory Rasputin, a mystic with no medical credentials and a talent for generating political scandal, to effectively influence senior government appointments because Rasputin's presence appeared to calm his hemophiliac son, which is an understandable personal motivation and a disqualifying basis for personnel policy in an empire of that scale. He assumed personal command of the Russian armies in 1915, ensuring that subsequent military failures would be attributed directly to him rather than to generals he retained the option to replace. He abdicated in March of 1917, and when his cousin King George V of Britain extended an offer of asylum, the offer was quietly withdrawn after the British government concluded that association with a figure so broadly unpopular was politically untenable. Being a tragic figure requires the absence of repeated choice. Nicholas had choices at every stage. He simply chose consistently, and the consistency had a direction. 16. Claudius is typically remembered as the accidental emperor, a passive figurehead propped up by the Praetorian Guard after Caligula's assassination, a man who stumbled into power by virtue of being the last adult male in the vicinity when the knives came out. This reading was largely constructed by historians working decades after his death, drawing on sources that had political reasons to minimize his competence and personal reasons to continue the family tradition of treating him as an embarrassment. His family had excluded him from public life for decades based on a limp and a stutter, a decision that meant he spent those years reading, writing historical scholarship, and accumulating knowledge while his relatives competed to destroy each other in increasingly creative ways. He oversaw the successful Roman invasion of Britain in 43 AD, a military expansion that had stalled for a century since Julius Caesar's 2 attempts had failed to produce lasting occupation. He expanded the civil service, reformed legal procedures, and extended citizenship to provincial populations in ways that strengthened administrative integration across the empire rather than straining it. The narrative of the bumbling accidental emperor was constructed by writers who had every incentive to maintain it and readers who found it more satisfying than the alternative. The man everyone at the family table treated as an embarrassment turned out to be the one running the best-managed household. This reveals something about the family, and it reveals something specific about who gets to write the account of the dinner afterward. 17. Athenian democracy is taught as the foundational model of participatory governance, an ancient system so enlightened it gave the world a template for a representative self-determination that remains the dominant political ideal 2.5 millennia later. The actual system excluded the majority of the population from participation entirely. Women, enslaved people, and foreign residents, who together constituted the substantial majority of people living in Athens, had no voice in the democratic process being celebrated for its inclusivity, which is a fairly significant structural qualifier to attach to the concept of participatory governance. The same democratic assembly that produced philosophers who wrote about justice and reason voted to execute Socrates on charges of corrupting youth and religious impiety, which stands as democracy's most documented act of self-commentary. The Sicilian expedition of 415 BC was approved by popular vote based on projections of easy victory that no one with actual military knowledge endorsed, destroyed an entire Athenian fleet in the process, and permanently damaged the city-state's strategic position in a way from which it never fully recovered. The mechanism of ostracism, whereby citizens voted to exile individuals considered too powerful or influential, removed some of the city's most competent leaders at precisely the moments when their competence was most needed. A system that excludes most people, occasionally executes its own philosophers, and periodically exiles its most capable figures is not a failed democracy. It is an early demonstration that democracy is a technology requiring ongoing maintenance, not a condition you install and then leave unattended. 18. Nero's persecution of Christians is taught as the defining Roman assault on the early church, the moment when imperial power turned systematically against a religious minority and established the template for centuries of state-sponsored religious violence. The actual historical picture is considerably more fragmented and considerably less centrally organized than this narrative requires. The Roman state had no comprehensive anti-Christian policy for most of the 1st and 2nd centuries. Persecution was regional, inconsistent, driven by local governors responding to local pressures, and varied enormously in intensity across geography and time period. Nero's actions following the 64 AD fire in Rome were publicly framed as punishment for alleged arsonists rather than as religious persecution specifically. And the targeted group was initially described in terms of association with a suspect community rather than theological opposition. Later emperors actively limited the scope of anti-Christian action. Trajan issued directives requiring formal legal procedures, and Hadrian mandated specific evidentiary standards before action could be taken. The most organized and geographically comprehensive persecutions came under Decius and Diocletian in the 3rd and 4th centuries, nearly 200 years after Nero, and even those campaigns collapsed within a few years of implementation. Attaching Nero's name to centuries of religious violence he did not design, organize, or sustain is like crediting the first person who ever dropped a match near a building with inventing the entire field of fire safety regulation. The connection exists at the beginning. The causation does not extend through the centuries that followed. 19. Commodus is remembered as a vain and theatrical emperor who renamed things after himself and staged gladiatorial performances, an eccentric who was more embarrassing than dangerous. The theatrical eccentricity and the genuine danger were not separate features of his reign. They operated simultaneously and reinforced each other in ways that made the combination considerably more costly than either quality alone would have been. He renamed Rome itself Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus, along with the months of the year, the city's military legions, the Senate, and the grain fleet, all after himself, which represents an administrative rebranding project of ambition that history has not seen replicated at comparable scale. He appeared in the Colosseum as a gladiator, but arranged his bouts so that his opponents fought with wooden weapons while he used steel, then billed the public treasury 1 million sesterces per appearance for the privilege of watching the emperor defeat disarmed combatants, which is simultaneously a sports fraud and an accounting irregularity. He developed a conviction that he was the reincarnation of Hercules, appeared in public wearing lion skins, and reportedly arranged for his own likeness to replace the head on existing Hercules statues throughout Rome, turning civic sculpture into a portrait program. He was ultimately killed by a conspiracy that included his personal wrestling partner, his mistress, and the Praetorian prefect, a coalition so diverse in its motivations that it constitutes a comprehensive performance review from every quadrant of his personal and professional life simultaneously. 20. Wilhelm II is cast as the calculating warmonger who deliberately engineered the path to the First World War, a militarist who pursued conflict as a strategic goal. The historical record describes something more operationally chaotic, an impulsive and deeply insecure figure whose defining characteristic was an inability to control the consequences of decisions he also could not stop making. He dismissed Otto von Bismarck in 1890, removing the architect of the diplomatic system that had been managing European tensions since the 1860s, and then watched the alliance structures Bismarck had carefully balanced begin to deteriorate without the maintenance they required. During the July crisis of 1914, he sent contradictory telegrams to Tsar Nicholas II, attempting to prevent the war, while simultaneously approving mobilization orders that made it operationally inevitable, a combination that suggests either profound confusion about causality or a deeply unfortunate inability to read his own paperwork. His documented marginal comments on incoming diplomatic dispatches horrified his own advisors, who found the impulsive reactions difficult to contain and impossible to use as policy guidance. When the war he helped initiate actually began, his own generals sidelined him from military decisions they considered too important to risk his involvement in, making him simultaneously the figure most responsible for initiating the crisis and the least involved in managing its conduct. Firing the one person who understood the machine, pressing every available button while the technicians look elsewhere, and then being escorted out of the control room is a specific category of contribution that deserves its own historical classification. 21. Chamberlain's reputation rests almost entirely on Munich, and the popular verdict is that he was a naive idealist who got outmaneuvered by a dictator he simply lacked the psychological sophistication to read accurately. The reality is more uncomfortable because it involves competent people making a considered decision that was still catastrophically wrong. British military chiefs in 1938 told Chamberlain directly that the Royal Air Force was not ready for war with Germany and that additional months of preparation would produce meaningful improvements in defensive capability. An assessment that was not entirely without foundation because the Battle of Britain a year later was genuinely close. The political miscalculation was not a failure of intelligence, but a fundamental misapplication of diplomatic assumptions. Chamberlain applied the operating framework of Edwardian good faith negotiation to a counterpart who had published his actual intentions in a widely available book and then behaved consistently with that publication. He returned from Munich declaring peace for our time with apparent sincerity. Within 6 months, Germany had occupied the remainder of Czechoslovakia, demonstrating that the commitment extracted at Munich had the shelf life of a press conference. His defenders argue he bought necessary preparation time. His critics note that Germany used that same time to rearm at a pace that made 1939 considerably more dangerous than 1938 would have been. Negotiating in good faith with someone who has documented their bad faith in print is not naivety. It is a reading comprehension problem with consequences scaled to the size of an empire. 22. Marie Antoinette said, "Let them eat cake." The quote is so perfectly calibrated to encapsulate aristocratic indifference to human suffering that it has been repeated as historical fact for over 2 centuries, attached to the most famous queen in French history and used as shorthand for the entire moral failure of the Ancien Regime. She almost certainly never said it. The phrase appears in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's autobiographical writing attributed to a great princess without a name, at a time when Marie Antoinette was approximately 9 years old and living in Austria, which is a geographical and biographical detail that creates obvious difficulties for the attribution. Historical records document Marie Antoinette making charitable contributions to communities experiencing hardship and intervening personally on behalf of individual subjects on multiple occasions during her time at Versailles, which does not describe a figure indifferent to suffering in ways the quote implies. Her genuine failures were real and consequential. Spending that was politically untenable during a fiscal crisis, political maneuvering that undermined reform efforts, a consistent failure to read the accelerating severity of the situation around her. None of those failures required a fabricated quotation to make the historical case against her. The quote survived because it was emotionally useful, not because anyone tracing it back to its source found Marie Antoinette at the other end. Attributing a statement to someone who was 9 years old at the time of its writing and living in a separate country requires a very particular commitment to a narrative that the chronology has already declined to accommodate. 23. McCarthy's defenders maintain that his tactics were aggressive, but his underlying premise was correct. Soviet infiltration was real, the threat was genuine, and history has validated his concern if not his methods. The specific concern and the specific investigations are different things, and conflating them is how the defense works. McCarthy's February 1950 speech claimed he had a list of 205 communists currently employed by the State Department. The number shifted to 57 in subsequent public statements, then to 81, then to 10 across the speeches delivered over a short period, suggesting the list was less a verified document and more a rhetorical instrument that he adjusted based on audience response rather than evidence. The confirmed Soviet espionage cases from that era, including Alger Hiss and the Rosenbergs, were uncovered through FBI counterintelligence operations and established investigative processes, not through McCarthy's Senate subcommittee. His investigations were extensively documented as procedurally abusive, using innuendo, guilt by association, and direct intimidation in place of evidence, and destroying careers on the basis of association rather than demonstrated conduct. He was censured by the Senate in 1954 by a vote of 67 to 22, meaning the majority of his own colleagues concluded that his conduct was professionally indefensible by the standards of the institution he was operating within. Taking credit for a fire department's work while running through the neighborhood, pointing at buildings and shouting fire at ones that are not burning, is not investigative achievement. It is a noise generated in proximity to actual work performed by other people with different methods. 24. The post-war consensus on Hirohito presented him as a passive figurehead, a constitutional monarch who was unaware of and uninvolved in his military's conduct, a symbol of Japanese cultural continuity who bore no meaningful responsibility for the war crimes committed under the banner of his empire. The post-war narrative was a deliberate construction, not a historical finding. American occupation authorities under General Douglas MacArthur made an explicit policy decision to shield Hirohito from war crimes prosecution based on a calculation that he was more useful as a stabilizing institutional symbol than as a defendant, a decision documented in internal American communications that have since been declassified and examined. Hirohito received detailed military briefings throughout the war, including comprehensive reports on operations in China and the broader Pacific Theater from generals who were reporting directly to him in his capacity as Supreme Commander. The idea that he was functionally unaware of what was being reported in those briefings strains the concept of briefings past the point where the word retains meaning. Documents and diaries that became available after his death in 1989 showed greater personal involvement in military planning decisions than the protected post-war account had acknowledged. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal prosecuted and executed multiple Japanese military and political leaders while simultaneously constructing a legal and narrative barrier around the emperor, which is a prosecutorial architecture that served political purposes rather than evidentiary ones. Receiving detailed operational briefings throughout a war and then being declared uninformed at the war's conclusion is not exoneration. It is a diplomatic agreement to describe a document differently than it reads. 25. Cleopatra is taught as the great Egyptian queen, a ruler whose identity, culture, and loyalty were indigenous to the land she governed, a figure so synonymous with Egypt that her image defines the country's ancient brand in global popular imagination. She was the last ruler of a Greek dynasty that had governed Egypt for nearly 3 centuries before she was born, and had maintained Greek cultural practices so rigorously throughout that time that she was reportedly the first member of her entire royal line to actually learn the Egyptian language. The Ptolemaic dynasty began with one of Alexander the Great's generals taking control of Egypt in 305 BC, meaning the family had been ruling the country for 275 years by the time Cleopatra came to power, governing Egypt without learning Egyptian in a way that suggests their relationship to the culture they ruled was administrative, rather than participatory. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were as much strategic diplomacy as personal connection, representing attempts to secure Roman military support for a kingdom facing absorption into an expanding empire rather than autonomous romantic choices made in a position of security. She died in 30 BC, and Egypt immediately became a Roman province, meaning her strategy ultimately failed, though it extended Egyptian nominal independence by decades longer than the military and political position she inherited would otherwise have warranted. The most recognizable Egyptian ruler in global popular culture came from a family that governed Egypt for 275 years while speaking Greek, which is a useful reminder that branding and geographic origin occupy different categories that marketing frequently declines to distinguish. 26. The Boston Tea Party is framed as a significant political shock that jolted the British government into recognizing the seriousness of colonial resistance and forced a reassessment of imperial policy in North America. The British government's actual initial response was irritation rather than reassessment, and the countermeasures Parliament chose were so disproportionate to the original incidents that they accomplished something the Tea Party itself could not. They unified colonists who had fundamentally disagreed about independence. The Tea Party destroyed approximately 342 chests of East India Company tea, a commercial loss that was meaningful to a trading company and essentially marginal to an empire operating at the scale Britain was operating at in 1773. Parliament's response: the Coercive Acts of 1774 closed Boston Harbor entirely, revoked Massachusetts' Charter of Self-Governance, and required colonists to provide housing for British soldiers in their private residences, measures so punitive that colonists immediately named them the Intolerable Acts, which is not how you want your legislation to be nicknamed by the people it governs. Benjamin Franklin, who had been in London conducting diplomatic negotiations aimed at reconciliation, described the Coercive Acts as destroying every remaining path to a negotiated resolution. The First Continental Congress assembled directly in response to the Coercive Acts, bringing together coordinated delegates from colonies that had not previously operated in concert, meaning Parliament's reaction to a property destruction incident produced the unified colonial political body it had been trying to prevent. If someone throws a stone at your window and you respond by demolishing their entire neighborhood, the stone is not the story that survives. 27. Wilson's legacy is taught as enlightened internationalism. The 14 points as a vision for a just and stable post-war order. The League of Nations as a framework for collective security that the Senate tragically refused, a progressive foreign policy undermined by domestic political failure. The internationalist vision coexisted with domestic racial policies so deliberate and harmful, they reversed progress that had been accumulating since the Civil War, and a foreign policy that routinely intervened militarily in the sovereignty of nations he simultaneously claimed to be protecting through self-determination principles. Wilson resegregated the federal civil service within months of taking office in 1913, reversing integration that had been in place since Reconstruction, and told black leaders who came to protest the policy that segregation was being implemented for their own benefit, a claim delivered with apparent sincerity that required considerable detachment from the actual experience of the people receiving it. His administration intervened militarily in Haiti, Nicaragua, Mexico, and the Dominican Republic during his presidency, occupying and shaping the governance of sovereign nations while advocating for national self-determination in European context, a principle whose geographic application had clear limits. His rigid refusal to accept any Senate modifications to the League of Nations Covenant, despite being advised by allies that compromise was essential for ratification, contributed directly to the Senate's rejection of American membership in the body he had designed. Designing a framework for international self-determination while occupying Caribbean nations and resegregating your own government is not hypocrisy in the conventional sense. It is a worldview with a carefully maintained definition of which worlds are included in the universal claim. 28. Genghis Khan occupies a simple position in popular history, a destroyer, a force of undifferentiated violence that swept across continents, leaving only ash and depopulation behind, a name synonymous with destruction as a terminal condition rather than a historical event with aftermath. The Mongol Empire he built was, for a sustained period following the conquests, the largest functioning free trade zone and most efficient long-distance communication network in the medieval world, which is not the detail that appears on the t-shirts, but is nonetheless part of the same ledger. The Pax Mongolica, the period of relative stability across the empire following consolidation, facilitated the Silk Road's peak commercial activity, allowing goods, people, diseases, and ideas to move between China and Europe with a reliability that had not previously existed at that scale. Genghis Khan implemented meritocratic military promotion, religious tolerance across the empire's extraordinary geographic span, and established the Yam postal relay system, capable of transmitting messages hundreds of miles per day, which was the fastest communication technology available anywhere on Earth at the time. The population losses from the Mongol campaigns are estimated at 40 million people, roughly 10% of the world's population in that period, which occupies the same historical ledger as the administrative achievements and cannot be separated from them by selective accounting. His campaigns in Central Asia deliberately destroyed irrigation infrastructure that had sustained agriculture for centuries, creating desertification that persists in affected regions today. Building the world's largest postal service on top of the remains of the cities you burned to clear the land for, it is an achievement that resists the simple categories we prefer to use. 29. The popular account of Nixon's downfall presents Watergate as an isolated operational failure, a single rogue intelligence operation that a president unwisely tried to cover up, a contained scandal that does not reflect the broader character of his administration or his political career. Watergate was the visible peak of a systematic pattern that had been operating for years, and it was visible specifically because it happened to have audio documentation at a moment when that documentation was legally accessible. The White House Plumbers Unit, created nominally to address national security leaks, had already burglarized a psychiatrist's private office before Watergate occurred, attempting to obtain personal records on Daniel Ellsberg, who had provided the Pentagon Papers to newspapers. Nixon maintained a formal enemies list of political opponents and directed the Internal Revenue Service to conduct audits targeting those individuals, which is the use of the federal tax enforcement apparatus as a personal political instrument against private citizens who had not been charged with any offense. The Saturday Night Massacre, in which Nixon fired the special prosecutor and precipitated the simultaneous resignations of the Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General in a single evening, occurred because Nixon feared what recordings he had made in the Oval Office would reveal when subpoenaed, not because any legitimate executive privilege claim was being defended. The tapes themselves documented Nixon discussing obstruction of justice within days of the original break-in, demonstrating that the cover-up was the initial strategy rather than a subsequent reaction to someone else's failure. Watergate was not the scandal. It was the scandal that came with audio at a time when the audio could be subpoenaed. The filing cabinet was full before anyone broke into the building. 30. The assassination of Julius Caesar is taught as a desperate act of Republican virtue. Senators who loved Rome so much, they were willing to commit murder to save it from the monarchical ambitions of a man who was going to destroy everything the Republic represented. The assassination destroyed the Republic it was designed to protect and produced a generation of civil wars that concluded in exactly the autocratic arrangement the conspirators claimed they were preventing. Caesar had publicly declined the crown on multiple occasions. Whether performatively or genuinely is a question historians continue to debate. But the symbolism of visible refusal was politically meaningful in a Roman context where the word king carried specific and toxic associations. The conspirators had no plan for what would happen after they killed Caesar. They stood in the Senate holding weapons while the rest of Rome failed to respond, as the liberators they had imagined they would appear to be a gap between anticipated reception and actual public response that reflects the thoroughness of their planning. Mark Antony's funeral oration shifted Roman public sentiment against the conspirators within days, forcing them to flee the city they had just liberated from a man who was no longer present to oppress it. The resulting civil wars lasted 13 years, killed hundreds of thousands of people across the Mediterranean world, and ended with Caesar's own designated heir becoming Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. The republic the Ides of March was meant to preserve was definitively and permanently gone within a single generation of the act intended to save it. Killing the person you believe wants to be king, and thereby producing a war that installs a king, is a very expensive route to the destination you departed specifically to prevent. 31. The Spanish Inquisition functions in the cultural imagination as the definitive example of medieval religious barbarism, a uniquely savage institution defined by mass torture and execution that represents the darkest possible intersection of state power and religious fanaticism. It was brutal and unjust, and it was significantly less lethal than secular courts operating in the same era, more procedurally regulated than the popular mythology requires, and active primarily during the Renaissance rather than the medieval period the imagery invokes. Modern historical estimates place total executions by the Spanish Inquisition across its entire 350-year operational history at between 3,000 and 5,000, a number that is genuinely atrocious and dramatically lower than the tens of thousands claimed in Protestant propaganda literature that shaped and sustained the myth through centuries of repetition. The Inquisition was actually prohibited from using certain torture methods that civil courts of the same period employed routinely, and its procedural requirements were stricter than those of secular courts in several documented respects, which is not a defense but is a historical fact that complicates the standard comparison. It operated from 1478 onward, deep into the Renaissance period, not the early medieval era that the visual iconography implies. It was finally abolished in 1834, meaning it outlived the medieval period by approximately 600 years and functioned as a modern institution throughout most of its existence. An institution becomes the universal symbol of medieval darkness while operating primarily during the Renaissance and continuing through the Napoleonic era. This says more about the power of effectively maintained propaganda than it does about the accuracy of the historical timeline being invoked. 32. Hitler's military reputation rests on a specific interpretation, tactical genius, in the early war years, followed by deterioration as he overextended and increasingly interfered with professional generals who knew better. The early victories reflected German military professionalism that succeeded largely despite his involvement rather than because of it, and the interference with professional military judgment began considerably earlier than the reputation's timeline suggests. During the fall of France in 1940, Hitler issued the halt order stopping the armored advance on Dunkirk, allowing 338,000 Allied troops to evacuate across the Channel. His generals disputed the order. The soldiers who escaped fought for the next 5 years on multiple fronts. He declared war on the United States 4 days after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, a voluntary decision for which no treaty obligation existed and which brought the world's largest industrial economy into active military alliance against him at a moment when the Eastern Front was already consuming resources at an unsustainable rate. He repeatedly overruled professional military commanders on the Eastern Front, insisting on holding positions that were militarily untenable, contributing directly to the catastrophic encirclement at Stalingrad and similar disasters that followed the same pattern. In 1944, his insistence that the Normandy landings were a diversionary feint and that armored reserves could not be released without his personal authorization delayed the counterattack during the hours when it could have been most effective. Voluntarily declaring war on a country with 10 times your steel production while already fighting a two-front war is not strategic overextension. It is an active decision, made freely and in writing, to add a third opponent to a position that was already unsustainable. 33. The Cultural Revolution is taught as an ideological campaign. Mao's attempt to revitalize Chinese revolutionary culture by targeting institutions and individuals who represented bourgeois values, a political movement that, however brutal in execution, emerged from genuine ideological conviction about the direction of Chinese socialism. The Cultural Revolution was primarily a political power consolidation mechanism wearing ideological clothing. Mao had lost substantial influence within the Communist Party following the Great Leap Forward disaster, and the Cultural Revolution began in 1966, directly after internal party meetings, where his policies had been subjected to criticism, he found unacceptable. Red Guards were directed specifically at established party officials and institutional leadership, targeting the precise people who might challenge Mao's authority within the existing power structure, which is a more accurate description of the operational priority than cultural renovation. Universities were closed for years, professionals and intellectuals were sent to labor camps, irreplaceable historical documents and artifacts were systematically destroyed, and an estimated 1.5 million people died during the decade the campaign operated. Mao ended the Cultural Revolution himself when it began destabilizing institutional functions. He needed to maintain his own position, dissolving the Red Guard organizations when they became operationally uncontrollable, demonstrating with clarity that the campaign had always been a managed political instrument rather than a genuine ideological transformation with its own momentum. Launching a decade-long national campaign to systematically destroy everyone who criticized your previous decade-long national campaign is not cultural renovation. It is a very large and expensive document shredding operation conducted at a scale that required millions of participants to execute. 34. The Crusades occupy a clean moral geography in the popular telling. European Christian aggression directed at a peaceful Islamic world, a one-directional campaign of violence that represents religious imperialism in its foundational form. The full historical picture involves military expansions in multiple directions, alliance structures that cross religious lines, and political complexity that the binary framing cannot contain without losing most of the content. By 1095, when Pope Urban II called the First Crusade, Islamic military expansion had already conquered Christian North Africa, the Iberian Peninsula, Sicily, and the Levant over the preceding 4 centuries, fundamentally altering the religious geography of regions that had been Christian for centuries before the conquests. The First Crusade was partly triggered by Byzantine Emperor Alexios I's direct request for Western military assistance against Seljuk Turkish forces that had defeated his armies at Manzikert in 1071 and were threatening Constantinople itself. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 never reached Jerusalem. It concluded with Crusader forces sacking Constantinople, a Christian city and the capital of the Byzantine Empire that had requested Crusader assistance a century earlier in one of the more spectacular failures of stated military mission in organized warfare. Crusader states in the Levant routinely formed military alliances with Muslim rulers against other Muslim rulers, and vice versa, because the political geography of the region was too fractured and shifting for the religious binary the popular narrative requires to function as an actual description of events. A conflict that begins with a Christian emperor requesting help and ends with Crusaders burning a Christian capital was never adequately described by the framework being used to explain it. 35. Lenin is cast as the moderate revolutionary, the pragmatic founding figure, whose socialism was subsequently perverted by Stalin's pathological brutality, a distinction that allows observers to maintain the ideology while attributing the crimes to the individual who implemented it most extensively. Lenin established the institutional infrastructure of Soviet repression. Stalin inherited it, expanded its scale, and operated it with greater systematic intensity. He did not invent it. The Cheka, the secret police organization that became the NKVD and later the KGB, was founded by Lenin in December 1917 within months of the revolution, making it one of the first significant institutional decisions of the new government rather than a later addition. The Red Terror of 1918 explicitly authorized mass executions of designated class enemies, the taking of hostages from targeted social groups, and the establishment of concentration camps documented in formal policy directives issued under Lenin's authority rather than improvised by subordinates operating beyond oversight. During the 1921-22 famine, Lenin's government continued exporting grain while millions of Soviet citizens starved, and he rejected substantial portions of international relief aid on the grounds that foreign assistance carried unacceptable influence implications. The suppression of the Kronstadt uprising in 1921, where sailors who had supported the revolution rebelled against its outcomes, was ordered by Lenin and implemented by Trotsky, not Stalin, using tactics that established the template for subsequent suppressions of internal dissent, crediting the person who designed and built the machine with innocence because a later operator ran it. At higher capacity is a division of responsibility that the machine's original blueprints do not support. 36. Prohibition is the settled example of well-intentioned policy catastrophically overreaching, a moralistic crusade that achieved nothing, created organized crime, and demonstrated permanently that the government cannot successfully regulate private behavior. The settled example leaves out the part where it worked, at least partially, which is inconvenient for a narrative that requires total failure to make its point. Alcohol consumption dropped substantially during Prohibition, with estimates suggesting it fell to approximately 30% of pre-Prohibition levels in the early 1920s. Liver cirrhosis deaths declined measurably during the Prohibition period. Hospital admissions for alcohol-related conditions decreased. These are documented public health outcomes that existed alongside the bootleggers, the speakeasies, and the organized crime revenue streams that became the dominant cultural memory of the era. The failure was enforcement, not concept. Prohibition was chronically and deliberately underfunded, allocating far too few federal agents to cover a continental nation against a product that was trivially easy to produce in domestic settings and enormously profitable to distribute through illegal channels. Organized criminal organizations existed before Prohibition. Bootlegging provided them a revenue base that allowed expansion into other criminal activities, which they retained after repeal in 1933, which is a genuine and lasting negative consequence of the policy period. Declaring something a total failure because you refused to fund its implementation adequately and then watched it produce predictable consequences is a lesson about implementation rather than about the original objective, which is exactly why the lesson keeps being forgotten and the story keeps being simplified into a cleaner moral that fits more comfortably into a single paragraph. 37. The defense of the 2003 Iraq invasion frequently retreats to a specific position. The intelligence was wrong, but it was wrong for everyone, and acting on faulty intelligence in good faith is a mistake rather than a deception. Multiple independent investigations concluded that the intelligence failures were not uniformly distributed, and the pattern of which assessments were amplified and which were minimized follows a direction that is difficult to attribute entirely to good faith misreading. The Iraq Survey Group, a 1,400-person investigation commissioned and funded by the American government, concluded in 2004 that Iraq had no active nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons programs at the time of the invasion. Not that the programs were hidden or destroyed, but that they did not exist in any operational form. The Silberman-Robb Commission in 2005 described the intelligence community's weapons assessment as one of the most damaging intelligence failures in American history, a characterization issued by a body the administration itself had created to review the question. The Downing Street Memo, a classified British government document from July 2002, stated explicitly that intelligence and facts were being fixed around the policy, written 8 months before the invasion and first published in 2005. The State Department's own intelligence bureau dissented from the National Intelligence Estimate's conclusions on Iraqi weapons programs, and that dissent was placed in footnotes rather than the headline findings. Going to war to locate something that is not there and then explaining that its absence proves it was moved, is a closed logical structure that no additional searching can open from the inside. 38. The Bay of Pigs disaster is attributed primarily to the CIA, with Kennedy cast as a new president who inherited a flawed operation designed by the previous administration and was ambushed by its failures before he could fully assess its feasibility. Kennedy made specific operational decisions that directly altered the plan's central assumptions, and those modifications were consequential to the outcome in ways that the attribution to CIA planning cannot absorb without distortion. Kennedy canceled the second airstrike wave that military planners had identified as essential for neutralizing Cuban air power before the amphibious landing. The cancellation came from the White House. The surviving Cuban Exile Brigade's supply ships were sunk because Castro's Air Force, which the canceled strikes were supposed to have destroyed, remained operational and sank them. Kennedy also moved the designated landing site from Trinidad to the Bay of Pigs at the last stage of planning, a location that the original planners considered operationally inferior and that offered significantly fewer options for retreat if the mission failed to achieve its initial objectives. He subsequently told the press that the failure provided lessons about more careful oversight of future intelligence operations, a statement that accepted the CIA's institutional framing of the failure, while his own decisions had materially altered the plan they were being blamed for not executing successfully. Modifying a plan, canceling its critical components, and allowing the original planners to carry the weight of the consequences. Those modifications produced is a form of leadership that leaves no fingerprints and accepts no audits. 39. Thatcher's economic legacy is presented as national rescue. A leader who inherited a country in terminal industrial and fiscal decline and implemented the difficult reforms necessary to establish the foundation for subsequent prosperity, the bold choices that unpopular figures make because the comfortable alternatives are unsustainable. Her economic record is genuine and mixed in ways the hagiography does not accommodate. Unemployment rose from 5.3% to over 13% between 1979 and 1982 under monetarist policies that deliberately used high unemployment as an inflation-fighting instrument, with the human costs of that instrument concentrated geographically in industrial communities in northern England, Wales, and Scotland, rather than distributed evenly across the population that voted for the policy. The deindustrialization of those regions during her tenure closed communities whose economic structures have not been replaced or rebuilt in the 4 decades since, which is a consequence with a duration that exceeds the policy period that generated it. The financial deregulation of the Big Bang in 1986 expanded the City of London's influence and established operational conditions for financial practices that contributed materially to the 2008 financial crisis, which arrived well after the political benefits of deregulation had been collected. GDP growth during her tenure was broadly comparable to the post-war consensus period she consistently criticized, suggesting the economic transformation she implemented changed the distribution of growth's benefits more substantially than it changed the growth rate itself. Solving one neighborhood's problem by relocating it to a different neighborhood and then leaving before the second neighborhood's invoice arrives is not comprehensive economic management. It is temporal and geographic redistribution of consequences, which is a different category of achievement. 40. The preferred account of the Iraq War decision describes Bush as a trusting president who acted in good faith on intelligence produced by agencies that failed him, a leader who was misled rather than one who led in a misleading direction. The administration's documented behavior before and during the run-up to the invasion shows a consistent pattern of elevating intelligence that supported the predetermined conclusion while minimizing or sidelining analysis that complicated it, which is a different activity than being misled by an independent institutional failure. The Downing Street memo from July 2002 stated that intelligence and facts were being fixed around the policy, written by British officials observing American decision-making from close proximity 8 months before the invasion began. The State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research formally dissented from the National Intelligence Estimate's weapons conclusions, a dissent that was technically included in the document and practically invisible in its placement, buried in footnotes, while the headline assessment went in the direction that mattered for the decision being made. The Office of Special Plans, a Pentagon unit created by senior Defense Department officials, conducted independent intelligence analysis that bypassed normal interagency review processes and consistently produced assessments more favorable to the invasion than the professional intelligence community's findings. No senior administration official faced legal accountability for representations made to Congress and the public about the certainty of the weapons assessment. Being misled by an intelligence agency requires not knowing what that agency was being pressured to produce, which becomes a progressively more difficult state of unknowing to maintain when you are the source of the pressure. 41. Chavez is defended as a genuine revolutionary whose socialist project was undermined from outside. American interference, artificially suppressed oil prices, and the coordinated hostility of international capital working to ensure that the alternative he represented could not demonstrate viability. The structural problems in the Venezuelan economic model were present and compounding before the oil prices fell and before the external pressure became the dominant explanation and the political centralizations Chavez implemented removed the corrective mechanisms that might have adjusted course before the compounding became irreversible. Venezuela's economy became more dependent on oil under Chavez than it had been before his presidency, not less. By the end of his time in office, oil represented over 96% of export earnings, making the economy substantially more vulnerable to commodity price fluctuations than the one he had inherited and promised to transform. He nationalized over 1,000 companies across multiple industries, many of which declined in productivity following nationalization, and the agricultural seizures contributed to food shortages that were visible and documented before the oil price collapse, that his defenders identify as the primary cause. His systematic weakening of independent institutions, including the judiciary, the electoral infrastructure, and the central bank's operational autonomy, eliminated the institutional capacity to identify policy failures and generate course corrections before they accumulated into crises. The humanitarian disaster that peaked after his death in 2013 resulted from his successor continuing the policies Chavez had designed, which suggests the system itself rather than a specific individual's misapplication was the primary variable. Building an economy on a single commodity and then dismantling every mechanism designed to warn you that this is structurally fragile is not a revolution undermined from the outside. It is a self-sealing system engineered to prevent the feedback it required to survive. 42. The comfortable assumption running through every political era, the one that allows each generation to study the previous generation's failures with confident detachment, is that political leaders learn from history that the catastrophic mistakes documented in the archives function as genuine warnings rather than as entertainment for future generations who will make comparable errors with updated technology and different names. The pattern of invading Russia during winter has been repeated by Charles de Chenier of Sweden in 1708, Napoleon in 1812, and Hitler in 1941. 3 separate leaders across 3 centuries, each with access to the prior examples, each having done exactly what the prior examples documented as a method of catastrophic failure. Economic collapse through currency debasement, printing money faster than economic output can justify, has been the mechanism of governmental destruction from ancient Rome through Weimar Germany through 21st century Venezuela, with each iteration expressing institutional surprise at the outcome that the preceding iterations had already fully documented. The pattern of popular leaders concentrating power, systematically dismantling institutional checks, and then discovering that those institutions were also protecting them from their own worst decisions, is documented across enough cases to constitute a repeating finding rather than an isolated observation. Leaders who succeed in learning from history frequently face the problem that their successors have no direct memory of the lessons that shaped the successful leader, and institutional knowledge decays within 1 to 2 political generations with remarkable consistency across political systems. History is not a warning system that has failed. It is a warning system that has worked precisely as designed, producing clear and documented cautions delivered to people who have consistently concluded they are the exception, at which point the system's accuracy is confirmed again. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.